do is help grassroots community groups throughout the whole country fight off dirty energy and waste facilities of various sorts. So this workshop is on false solutions to climate change. And there are all kinds of false solutions. We're going to talk about them in a few different ways. Some of them in larger conceptual areas, which are kind of fun. We'll get to them at the beginning to reward you for being on time. And then we'll get into some of the policies that are false solutions, and then as we have time, we can get into some of the technologies that are false solutions. I've done whole 2-hour workshops on just the technologies piece of that, so we will not be going into detail on why nuclear and all these other things are false solutions, but I hope to go into that as deeply as you'd like to as time allows later, and then we can always talk for the rest of the event about whatever else going on. So I'm going to start this with a story that a few of you have heard already. I'm not going to move the next slide, I'll give it away, yes. So when I was in my undergrad, there was, this is in central Pennsylvania, pickup trucks are not uncommon, so a pickup truck that had 2 stickers on it. One was some kind of pro-logging sticker, it was like, have you hugged a logger today? And the other one just said 3 words, it said, Smokey needs you. And I was thinking about this, I was like, how is it that both of these stickers could be on the same truck? And how is it that the second sticker didn't even have the message on it? It was just those 3 words. Nothing, no pictures, nothing. It was just Smokey needs you. Now, what does that mean?
You want to burn the trees down. Harvest.
Something about burning trees. Don't burn trees down?
Yeah, the Smokey is for
Who? How do you know this?
Smokey. Bear.
Smokey's a bear? It didn't say anything about a bear on there.
I know, but I mean that's why I interpreted it.
Oh,
Because
okay.
Smokey the bear needs you to protect the forest so they can harvest it for logging.
Okay, so there's this bear called Smokey that wants you to do something.
Okay.
This guy.
Yeah.
We all know Smokey.
We all know Smokey. Okay, how do you know Smokey? How is it that they don't have to print the message on the bumper stickers anymore? They just have to say Smokey needs you and you already know. The message is like the message is in your head and that bumper sticker is the key to unlocking it, right?
Yeah.
So how do they get Smokey the bear in all your heads?
Show them to us over and over.
Over and over and
They
over.
used to do that on TV all the time.
But does he change your behavior? That's the question.
Well, yeah. So who funds Smokey the bear? Obviously you've seen a lot of this because you all know who Smokey is without even seeing a picture or his message,
U.S. government.
right? You already know his message. So who's
U.S. government.
U.S. government co-sponsors it. But what I'm looking for is deeper than this. The same entity that sponsors Smokey the Bear also puts out messages that say, don't drink and drive, pick up your litter, join the military, tutor kids after school.
The ad council.
The Ad Council. So who's the Ad Council? You see, if you're the average person in the U.S., about 400 impressions per year, more than 1 a day, you see an Ad Council ad on average. Now, who's funding all this stuff? Who's the Ad Council? And no one has any idea.
No.
The government does not support them. No,
This
I mean,
is
they don't fund them.
public service.
They use public service announcements.
Yeah.
But someone pays a lot of money for the billions of impressions a year they have nationwide. Lobbyists? Well, entities that have lobbyists,
Corporations.
corporations. So once I saw a full-page ad in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it's rare that they amass themselves like this, but it said, and now a word of thanks to our sponsors, thanks. This is back in 1994. This is before they had a website that says similar stuff. And the backdrop of it was all small print of all the biggest corporations that I recognized at the time. Half of them probably merged by now. And, no, seriously, right? So,
3 names behind it.
recently, when I wrote an article called Occupy Earth Day, where I really exposed this whole story, you can find it here. Actually, I'm ruining the punchline here a little bit, so I'm not going to show you that whole title yet. So, when I was researching this, I found that exactly 50 of the top 100 corporations in the U.S. fund the Ad Council in recent years. Why are they doing this? What is the common thread between all those messages that they're funding?
Corporate control. It's not.
They don't say like obey, like corporations won't control you, puppet strings. I mean, they don't say that. They say like pick up your litter. So what's wrong with that?
Yeah.
And why would McDonald's and Walmart and all these companies want to tell you this?
Without you knowing it, them telling you.
Yeah. So it's not to get them good PR. You don't even know it's the ad council. Most people are like, I do these workshops. People are like, I don't know who it is that I see every day. And there's like ad council, like, oh yeah, maybe I do see this all the time. So like, it's not even like they want you to know the word ad council. It's like subliminal. They just want they want to insinuate ideas into your head. Now, what is the common thread between all those ads? Smokey the Bear's exact message.
If you just leave things alone. Just let us
No, almost. Say that again?
Personal responsibility.
Personal responsibility. That's exactly why they exist. And they have 5 criteria on whether they'll take on an ad campaign. And one of them is explicitly that it has to have a personal change angle. And so what they do, Smokey the Bear's exact message, what is it, word for word? Only you can prevent forest fires. The most important word in that sentence is you. So why are these companies funding this now? Why is corporate America speaking to you through the ad council, subliminally, essentially, to tell you that you are the cause of social problems and that you are the solution to social problems?
Blame them.
What?
So we don't blame them.
So you don't blame them, right? It couldn't be more clear once you see it, right?
That's great.
I mean, it's the wizard behind the curtain. And they fund Keep America Beautiful for the same reason. They are listed in the Greenpeace Guide to Anti-Environmental Organizations. Now, who would fund Keep America Beautiful? Who has an interest to fund Keep America Beautiful?
You mean what organization?
What corporations have an interest in funding Keep America Beautiful? It's a corporate front group. It's an
All the
anti-environmental
beverage
group.
makers that all their cans end up on the highways.
Right. So PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, who else?
Budweiser.
Budweiser. Who else? What else makes up litter?
Fast food.
McDonald's funds them. Probably.
Pepsi.
Cigarette companies, huge. Polystyrene and other packaging councils fund them. And the 2 biggest waste corporations in the world fund them. Because after all, they want you to think that the responsible thing to do is pick up their litter after them and put them in landfills and incinerators where they do more damage to the environment than they did on the side of the road. But where Waste Management and Browning Ferris Industries, or now Allied in the public, make the profits for it, because they don't make money if you leave it on the side of the road. So they are designed, the Ad Council, Keep America Beautiful, and all these other PR groups that use a similar model, are designed to distract you and keep you from focusing on the systemic corporate entities and government entities that need to be changed in order to rein in corporate behavior and actually get to the root of our problems. And they don't want you to do things like the high schoolers that teamed up with landfill activists in the late 80s and early 90s and mailed those styrofoam clamshells back to Oak Brook, Illinois, where McDonald's corporate headquarters is, until they stopped using them. They're designed to make you think to not do that. When Dennis Hayes, as a student organizer in the First Earth Day in 1970, was giving a fiery speech, I wasn't even alive then, but I read about it, at the First Earth Day, saying how they need to keep the corporations from turning the environmental movement into a pick up their litter movement. That was like 43 years ago now, and the corporations have succeeded largely in turning entry-level environmentalists into people who generally don't fight the system. They're picking up after corporations. They're doing voluntarily recycling and different things that really don't attack corporate power where it's supposed to be attacked. So this article gets into this, and we're going to go a little deeper into this lesson, then we'll move into the climate change stuff more directly. So when I was in undergrad as a sociology major, I had to read a book in a class on race and ethnic relations called A Different Mirror, A Multicultural History of the United States. And in that class I learned how the people in power keep us divided using different isms. They use racism, they use sexism, they use heterosexism, they use wedge issues like guns and abortion. They use everything to divide us except by class lines, where it's only acceptable to divide us the middle class versus the poor, or hating immigrants. That's acceptable, but the 1% versus 99%, that is the one way that it's intolerable to let people think into group identities, because then we outnumber them, and that's a big problem for the people in power. So they don't want that. So that book that was talking about the different racial groups that built this country talked about some of these tactics. It was very interesting how, like in the plantations in the South, in order to keep workers from organizing against their bosses, they would racially divide their workforces and pay one group less than the other and get them to resent each other so they'd fight each other instead of their bosses. This stuff still goes on today in just newer forms. But in the plantations in Hawaii, the sugar plantations, it was so deliberate. They had memos they would send each other, the plantation owners, to say, have this percentage of Filipinos, this percentage of Japanese, organize it this way. And the expression, the shit rolls downhill, actually, I believe, came from there because they lived on hills. And they would have one ethnic group in the middle, the bosses, of course, were on top, and the other one on the bottom, and they had no sewer systems at the time. So they did this deliberately to divide their workforces so that they can keep people controlled. Now, the Ad Council strategy is very dangerous in that it's the scientific perfection of the divide and conquer tactic, where they are dividing us into individuals so we don't even think in group identities. Now, it's okay to think in group identities where it doesn't matter, like Republican versus Democrat, different religions, sports, and things where they want to organize you in ways that you're still fighting each other over stuff that doesn't affect those in power. But the fact that they're watering down our thinking to the point of individualistic solutions distracts us from the corporate and systemic solutions that we really need to be doing. So you'll see when Al Gore is promoting his film that he had some years ago on Inconvenient Truth, and it's talking about these dreadful consequences of global warming, and the solution is to screw in a compact person light bulb, like disconnect maybe, like giant problems and individualistic solutions. So this is a kind of long story just to get down to that lesson, in that we are not going to solve giant systemic problems like climate change with individualistic solutions. And we need to recognize the PR tactics that are out there. Like I saw Chevron had an ad campaign a couple years ago, and I saw them all the bus stops in DC, where they were talking about as if they're taking responsibility to do the right thing with energy, and they were telling you to use less energy in your, it wasn't in your cars, I think it was in like light bulbs and stuff. It's like, wait, Chevron's an oil company, so of course they're not saying use less oil, they're saying use less electricity. And in the electricity sector, oil is like 2.5%, so they don't care about that. So they were doing this to make it seem like they're part of the solution when really they're just giving you individualistic ideas and making themselves a big oil company sound like they were good actors or something. So let's get into the current plans of what is being discussed right now. So we had the environmental movement cheer loudly recently when Obama finally gave that climate speech. We had to wait 4+ years for him to finally speak up and put some political capital on this issue of climate change. And what does he do? He did what he always was about, which is promoting every bad thing that could be promoted. Stuff that he was always about when he was a senator and voted for the most anti-environmental bill ever to pass Congress, which is the Energy Policy Act of 2005, the bill that the Bush-Cheney Energy Task Force gets the credit for, but the Democrats wrote when they were in control of the Senate. It was very pro-nuclear, pro all these bad things. And Obama's climate plan recently, if you actually read it or listen to his speech, he promotes all this stuff. The only thing that you can give him credit for not being in favor of is conventional coal plants. And yet he's still saying, well, we're not going to export conventional coal plants to other countries even. Well, that means he's in favor of still exporting coal gasification plants to Japan and other places. So coal gasification, the so-called clean coal, is something that Obama is still totally behind. You could see that in his policy that just came out on CO2 from his EPA, which I'll get into in the next slide. But he's been bragging about promoting all these things, oil and natural gas. He actually, you can find on YouTube, there's a video where he says that his administration, under his administration, they've built more pipelines than anyone before, that it's enough pipelines, oil pipelines, to encircle the earth and then some, he says. And so you can find this on video. It's all like documented stuff. It's not like some crazy conspiracy that Obama is like actually not what you think he is. He says, I mean, this is one of the issues where it's not like he's saying something good and doing something bad. He does that a lot. But he's actually saying bad stuff, and people are still like kissing up to him as if he's the savior. He's been about as bad as Bush on all the major energy issues. We're still fighting all these things, tar sands included, because his administration is busy promoting them. In his speech, he mentioned carbon trading as an option for the mechanism that he would use. This is the cap and trade proposal that environmental justice groups fought, and a lot of us really pushed back hard against because of the environmental justice impacts of what that means, and just the fact that it's ineffective. Just look at Europe and their cap and trade program. and corporate trade agreements like the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's also a transatlantic free trade agreement now being negotiated. And these are just dreadful corporate takeovers of global, like any kind of national sovereignty. These will enable corporations to basically run roughshod over our laws and laws of other countries. And a lot of that stuff in there is about energy, it's about intellectual property, and all sorts of other things that are very scary. And Obama's all about that. And it's being negotiated in secret. Congress people can't even get copies of the text of these trade agreements. Now, his CO2 rule just came out a couple weeks ago. I started reading through this thinking, hallelujah, like at least there's some rule. Finally he's going to apply to power plants and maybe like keep some of these things from having to be fought. Well, the EPA actually promotes it under the guise that it's not really going to make much of a difference. That's how they're selling the plan to Republicans and corporations. So they make a point that basically it's only going to apply to new coal plants. There's going to be one that applies to existing coal plants next year. We'll see how bad that turns out to be. I don't know what tricks they'll use with that one, but it only applies to new coal plants that don't have carbon capture and sequestration. So if they, and in the plan they actually go through and say which plants are still proposed that this would apply to. And there's maybe one plant that they're probably going to exempt that this policy would apply to in the whole country. And this is after there were like 200 some new coal plants planned since the, like around 2005 or so. One of them might be covered because the industry's already moved away from this between the work that our group has done, Sierra Club, and a lot of other groups, stopping tons of coal power plant proposals. We did the heavy lifting, and now Obama's coming in after that work was done and being like, okay, well now we'll pass a policy that will take care of what you already took care of. So the industry's not trying to build new coal plants except for fewer than 5 that would be the carbon capture sequestration type. They're mostly trying to move into building new natural gas power plants. And the bill is set up so that the limitation on CO2 is higher than the amount you would expect from natural gas power plants. So it's giving a free ride to a couple hundred natural gas power plants around the country. And we know from the fact that methane is about 105 times more potent than CO2, not the 21 to 25 times that EPA recently admitted that they're like, we're going to decide it's not 21, it's 25. Well, the science for at least 4 years now has been saying that's far, far higher than that. That 21 to 25 is over a 100-year time frame. NASA's latest data on that from 2009 says it's about 33 times worse than CO2 over a 100-year time frame. But if you look at over a 20-year time frame with how long it actually lasts in the atmosphere, they used to think it was 72, it's now 105 times it's understood to be that much worse. And because of all the leakage of natural gas through the infrastructure of just extracting it and pipelines and everything, so much leaks out, that's actually far worse than coal. We don't know how much, but we know it's worse than coal for climate change. So Obama's climate plan is going to make sure we move to something that's worse than coal, natural gas, to do this. Now, to come back to this for a second, the plants that do get built with carbon sequestration, the way they're going to sequester the carbon, in other words, put it underground and hope it doesn't leak out and suffocate entire towns like it could, the projects that are doing this are doing it in areas where there's oil that they can't get out of the ground still. And so they call these operations Ewall, or Enhanced Oil Recovery. Now, I looked at the government data on this recently and said, well, okay, if you're using this to get petroleum out of the ground, which you obviously are going to then burn, how much CO2 is in that extra petroleum that you wouldn't be able to get out of the ground compared to how much CO2 you're dumping into the ground to get it out? And it's like 80%. So you're almost entirely counteracting the point of sequestering this carbon by using it to get petroleum out of the ground that would otherwise stay there. So it's kind of ridiculous. But the other thing that gets a free pass is incineration. Whether we're talking about biomass or specifically trash incineration or other things in between, there's a whole spectrum of burnable things that are often described as biomass. And we know that this is worse than coal for CO2 emissions as well. Biomass, if you're talking like trees and wood, is about 50% worse than coal per unit of energy that they produce. And trash incineration is 2.5 times worse. And yet they market themselves as a climate solution. They say we're carbon neutral, trees regrow, and as if trees regrow and somehow know, oh, I'm supposed to suck up the CO2 molecules that came out of that power plant's extra amount of CO2 and not that one. I mean, it makes more sense to actually burn coal and plant trees than burn trees and plant trees, because trees are so inefficient. So I'm not promoting burning coal and planting trees, but it makes no sense. It takes about 40 years for the extra pulse of CO2 from burning a biomass, burning biomass in a plant. And I hate to use that term because it means so many things, but if you burn wood in an incinerator and you get 50% more CO2 out of the smokestack than you would if you were burning coal, it takes 40 years for the extra pulse of CO2 to get sequestered by trees again, so that's just as bad as coal. And then, of course, centuries before it becomes anywhere close to carbon neutral. So we don't have that kind of time to wait, and it doesn't make sense. And a federal court recently agreed when the Center for Biological Diversity sued EPA over this idea of them considering things carbon neutral and specifically exempting biomass from this rule. They won. And the court said, yeah, the atmosphere doesn't care if the CO2 came from this stack or this stack. It's still CO2 in the atmosphere, and you should count it. And instead, the EPA decided they're going to appeal that ruling and issue this rule that gives an exemption for biomass anyway, and then we'll have to battle that out later once they find some other loophole to be able to keep biomass burning as something that they promote. So the alternatives to coal are turning out to be things that are actually worse for global warming in Obama's CO2 rule. So there's a lot of linguistic detoxification as well, as we like to call it, for those of us who are used to fighting waste issues. There are all kinds of other terms, and I had this in from a presentation that was more for a waste-focused audience, so I won't get into all the details here. But just know that all these things are public relations terms. They're not even accurate. Like, you don't turn trash into steam. You turn it into toxic ash and toxic air emissions. They're waste of energy facilities, not waste to energy. You can't turn matter into energy without a nuclear reaction. But they use these terms to bamboozle people, make them think that these are solutions, when trash incineration, biomass incineration, all these other things are actually serious problems that are far worse than coal by most measures. Now, one of the false solutions out there, which could be a really good solution, except it doesn't turn out in a lot of cases to be what we expect it to be, are renewable portfolio standards. These are passed in 30 to 40 states, and usually when you get these laws passed, you think, we're going to get wind and solar now. That's what people push for when they promote these. You think that that's what you're going to get. But when you actually look at a lot of the states and how they're implemented, you find that there are all kinds of dirty things mixed in the definitions of what is renewable. Some states don't even use the word renewable anymore. Pennsylvania, we fought really hard to stop a bill that got passed anyway, and set a precedent that Ohio and West Virginia then followed, where they called alternative energy. Ohio went as far as putting nuclear power in there, which is just nuts. But Pennsylvania put in waste coal, coal gasification, and coal mine methane in there. And West Virginia even went as far as putting tire burning in there. So these things are considered renewable energy. And some states, if you look at how much renewable energy are you getting in these renewable portfolio standards that are like mandates for companies to have a certain amount of renewables in their mix, some of these states are as high as 80% of that energy, that renewable or alternative energy, coming from combustion sources. And most of these combustion sources, especially on global warming pollutants, but also on a lot of others, are worse than coal. And so these standards could be good, they could theoretically be clean, but they are not turning out that way in most states. There are also renewable fuel standards at the federal level, which is basically a way of saying that we're going to promote ethanol and waste to fuels technologies. Landfills are now trying to get in there with landfill gas burning as well.
What's wrong with fuel cells?
The problem with fuel cells is that they're not an energy source. Fuel cells operate on hydrogen, usually, and the hydrogen is not something that you can mine or stick a straw in the ground and get a bunch of hydrogen out. You have to get hydrogen from something. And 90%, this is an old statistic, maybe it's changed a bit, but most of the hydrogen that's produced is from steam reforming of natural gas. And so it's ultimately a fossil fuel that shouldn't be considered a renewable source. If you do get it from clean sources, the only way to do that is to electrolyze water. So you're putting usually grid power, so generally dirty energy in to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then you use a fuel cell to turn it back into electricity. Well, you get less electricity out than you put in to do that because there are conversion losses, and it's dirty power to begin with. So these laws don't require that be renewable electricity if they produce it that way, and they never produce it that way because it's cheaper to get from natural gas. Now, in Maryland, in the past year, they tried to do something novel. The trash incinerator industry, which has been successful in getting Maryland to be the first state to put trash incineration into the tier 1 of their renewable portfolio standard, the only state that now has it competing with wind, and now other states are trying to copy that bad model. They tried to go even further and say, we're going to have a municipal solid waste portfolio standard. In other words, we're going to make this policy that makes sure that all the trash in Maryland has to be burned before it goes to a landfill, to create a huge incentive for incinerators that they're trying to build there. So that, thankfully, we managed to stop, but it wouldn't surprise me if they come back with more attempts in other states to instill things in there. So a bit of an overview now of the rest of this. So we got policies that are false solutions and technologies that are false solutions. Got to hydrogen already, some a little bit on the others. So we're going to cover some of the policies mostly and then see what time we have to get into the technologies. So the way I'd like to sum this up is that there are worst, awful, bad, better, and best types of climate policies. The worst ones are ones like what they tried to pass with the Waxman-Markey bill back in 2009, where it's basically a cap-and-trade program. Does everyone know what cap-and-trade means? Should I define that? Does anyone not know what it means? Okay. So cap-and-trade basically is the idea that you have a certain amount of CO2 that is allowed to be emitted from all sources that emit CO2, or at least all the ones that are that are regulated by the policy. So it might just be smokestacks, not car tailpipes, for instance. And you set a certain amount, you say 100 units of CO2 are allowed to be emitted in this first year. And the idea is that you put that cap on it, and then some companies might produce more than, well, you ratchet it down over time. So you put a cap on it, you ratchet it down, maybe it's going to go down 90 and then 80 and then 70 units of whatever you started counting. And you let them trade with each other. So you might have one plant, say an oil refinery in Richmond, California, that's in a poor community of color that is being poisoned by this big oil refinery. And say they don't feel like doing the investments, Chevron that runs that refinery doesn't feel like investing in things that will reduce their emissions. So they're going to pay some other company that got credits that they're allowed to put CO2 in the atmosphere, and they'll trade credits with them. So that Chevron refinery, in order to keep polluting that community of color, they're going to buy credits from another power plant in, say, Utah that decided to shut down because they were not economical or something. So that other power plant now has credits they can sell. And what happens when you do this is you end up with hotspots. You end up with some communities that generally are the ones that don't have as much political power, that tend to be low income, tend to be communities of color, that are going to end up they're going to keep getting polluted in order for generally the wealthier, whiter communities to be the ones where the credits are being sold from. And that's why the environmental justice movement is very opposed to cap and trade. Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, there's also been a secondary market that's developed where, like, Goldman Sachs buys up these things and then marks them up and sells them.
Yeah.
So it's, it's
Wall
not
Street is a big
purely
supporter.
trading. It's marketing.
Totally. The Wall Street trading firms are very big proponents of this type of thing.
Guess why?
So the giveaways applies to when you first start off with who gets the right to pollute. Are you going to make them pay for that right, or are you going to give it away? So the bills that were promoted in 2009 would have just given them away. So some groups thought, well, we're going to be really like advanced here and push for them to auction off the right to pollute. And so these were like the progressive, so-called big environmental groups that were saying, we're going to still have cap and trade, we're just going to make them pay for maybe some portion of the credits by auctioning them at the beginning. Now, a step up from that is to do cap and trade with dividend. And basically what that means is they often call this fee and dividend, because, well, actually no, that's the next one, sorry, we'll come back to that. A dividend basically means if the cost of energy is going to go up for people, then we're going to make this up by giving them a check every month. And I'll get into the problems with that in a moment. The carbon tax, of course, tax is a bad word, so the folks pushing a carbon tax have learned that, gee, we should pretend it's not a tax, we'll call it a carbon fee, as if they're not going to catch on, as if the media and the Republicans and everyone else are going to start being like, oh, it's a fee, okay. Really? so they're going to call it a tax, trust me. In the political debate, it's still going to be called a tax. But the tax and dividend approach, you have Citizens Climate Lobby is one of the groups working to push this the hardest. And we have an open letter actually challenging them on this. You can pass this around. So we're opposed to a carbon tax. And that basically shocks a lot of people because people think carbon taxes are a good thing. And I wouldn't say we would lobby hard against it, but there are some structural problems with the carbon tax. And the reasons that we called out when we wrote this open letter to Citizens Climate Lobby, we had about 86 groups from 11 countries and 35 to 40 states within about a week sign on to this letter. We could have gotten many more if we had time to put into making a campaign out of it. But the things we called them out on were three things. First of all, the dividend checks that would go to people in the Sanders-Boxer bill that has been promoted, that is what they were lobbying for this past summer. The Citizens Climate Lobby, when they had a big conference in DC and started going to the halls of Congress and saying, pass a carbon tax. The Sanders-Boxer bill gives the monthly check only to legal US residents. So you've just basically divided the left side of the spectrum, because the 12 million undocumented residents of the United States are going to have energy costs increase and are not going to be getting a monthly check to make up for it, but everyone else will. So it just exacerbated the injustice that we have toward immigrants in this country, the undocumented people. And in doing so, you basically create a nice racist wedge that the industry can put right into the middle of this legislative effort. So that was just really misguided. So we called them out on the racism involved in that. Thankfully, Citizens Climate Lobby said, well, we don't support that. Our policy is to give it to everyone, even though they went and lobbied for the policy that doesn't. Anyway, so that was a little weird. But the more structural reasons that were opposed to a carbon tax are as follows. A carbon tax addresses only part of the spectrum of dirty energy. You have nuclear power, you have biomass and biofuels and waste incineration. You have all these different things that are a problem for communities, including large hydro, even there's other kinds of hydro, and there's geothermal on a commercial scale. Its open loop has also been problematic. And you're basically saying, out of the spectrum of dirty energy, we're going to punish one portion of it. We're going to punish the fossil fuel portion. And in doing so, you're going to put nuclear power and all these other false solutions at a competitive advantage. And we've seen studies showing that if you have even a weak carbon tax, you put nuclear power at a competitive advantage to the point where it's more economically viable than coal. Of course, there are all these subsidies that go to nuclear that make it already the point where that just pushes them over the edge. Nuclear power without all the subsidies would still never be economical. But the idea that they refuse to take responsibility for promoting other false solutions in a carbon tax is a problem. And the Citizens Climate Lobby has, as one of their advisors and had as their keynote speaker at their conference this past summer in DC, which I crashed by handing those things out, they had James Hansen as their speaker. Now, James Hansen is a well-respected NASA scientist who's been doing a lot to make people aware of global warming. But he's also, just in the past several months, been writing op-eds to the New York Times, or maybe it was Washington Post, promoting nuclear power. This guy is aggressively promoting nuclear power as the solution. That is a serious problem, and we need to rein this stuff in and get this guy to sit down and get the Citizens Climate Lobby to take responsibility and say, and the others out there, like the Carbon Tax Center, like Charles Komanoff, who pushes a carbon tax all the time, like they've admitted to me in writing, in emails, it's like, yeah, it's regrettable that it'll promote nuclear power. I'm like, well, do something about it then. Like, don't promote a carbon tax without also at the same time actually being on our side and saying no to nuclear and no to these other false solutions. But they're not doing that. In the bills, in the carbon tax bills, they also explicitly and implicitly promote biomass and biofuels. Some of it's implicit just by punishing fossil fuels and not punishing biofuels, which are worse for the climate than coal. But they actually take some of the tax money and put it into a fund that promotes clean technology. And they define clean technology to include biomass and biofuels. So they're going to actually do a carbon tax, they're going to tax coal, oil, and gas, and then put the money into promoting something that's worse than coal for the climate. It makes no sense. So we need to really wake them up on these issues and get them to have stronger policies. Now, the best thing that we can do, rather than think that the market knows best, and that somehow by putting a dollar on fossil fuels that is going to know to shift to the clean stuff and not the dirty stuff, and to do it over a certain time frame, which it doesn't do. The market's not going to have some invisible hand that does the right thing because we think it should. So what we need is a mandated shift to clean solutions. We know what the clean solutions are. They've been talked about many times. The speaker earlier went into them. They're outlined in the back of this flyer. Basically, what we need to do is say what we actually want. Okay, this I'll skip some of these slides. There's some juicy quotes in here you can get about why tax and cap and trade is a terrible idea, why the financial markets even know it and are planning on gaming the system and stuff. They're fun quotes, but I'll skip them for now. Okay, so this is what I think climate solutions in a nutshell would look like. We need to cut our energy demand in half and then half again in this country. If we're going to come anywhere close to global justice and parity on carbon emissions, we really need to get to where we ought to be. Right now, we're already using about twice as much as per person energy as people in Europe are, and I used to say that's true of Japan, but that was before they shut down all of their nuclear reactors, which is about 30% of their electricity supply. So we could do this without sacrificing quality of life. I mean, we have the technology to do this, we have the know-how to do this. There's no reason we shouldn't be cutting deep using conservation and efficiency. So I use the word efficiency in here, but really conservation comes first, then efficiency, and then wind, solar, energy storage are the answers here. So the whole idea of a renewable portfolio standard would be the second piece. We need something that basically says we're going to phase in the clean technologies and make sure they're actually defined to be clean. So none of this bio stuff, no burning anything. Just say basically wind and solar are going to be what we rely on. There may be some other like micro hydro or tidal things that make sense somewhere. But for the most part, we're talking about wind and solar. And we need to scale them up at a certain time frame so that they meet the remaining demand that we can't just eliminate the need for. To make a lot of this possible, we also need to shift the money. We have about $74 billion a year that go in dirty energy subsidies. We can't just let that keep going, and we can't just cut that out and pretend that things are just going to make up for it. We basically need affirmative action for clean energy sources. And we need to do that by taking that $74 billion and shifting it over to the clean stuff. And we could probably put a lot more than $74 billion a year, considering we spend so much on the military, which is a way huger dirty energy subsidy. It's largely an oil subsidy, but we're now going to war for some other things. We're going to war for natural gas, like Afghanistan, which has turned into a war for electric cars with lithium. We're going to war in Mali for uranium for France. So it's a dirty energy subsidy in a number of ways, and we need to shift that as well. We also need a national zero waste policy that starts with at least 75% recycling and waste reduction and composting goal, and to get as high as we can, as close to 100% as we can. There are some communities around the world that have hit close to about 90% diversion from landfills and incinerators. And in doing so, we can reduce 37% of our country's greenhouse gases right there by having, and that's just, I think, if we had 75%. We also need sustainable agriculture. We can reduce about 20% of greenhouse gas emissions by eating lower on the food chain, by not importing food from so far away, by growing it locally and having it sustainably grown. And all of these things are politically unrealistic. They're politically unrealistic because we have a Congress that is controlled by corporations. So this is not a typo down here where it says zero. The first thing that we need to do to get any of this stuff done, otherwise we're going to be fighting over, do we have a horrible bill or a truly dreadful bill? You know, I mean, that we don't have time for that. We also don't have time to win public campaign financing, but we have to be working at that at the same time because we've spent too many decades not really addressing the root of the problem, and we need to really be addressing that as much as we can. So let me recap any things that are worse than coal that I might not have pointed out. Nuclear is worse than coal in that a single plant can make large areas of the world uninhabitable. A single coal plant cannot do that. It takes the whole fossil fuel infrastructure to do that. So nuclear is not a solution that, aside from all the devastation that it creates, even when it's operating normally, even in terms of just the radioactive air and water emissions from nuclear reactors, the whole fuel chain is incredibly destructive. And it's just so darn expensive. It sucks up about 60% of all the R&D subsidies over the past 60 years have gone just to nuclear power. So it sucks up all the funding for real solutions. And we don't have time to build new reactors either, or money, because they just take too much time and they cost too much money. I got into the natural gas stuff. Landfill gas is one of the most confusing things. I've done whole workshops on this, so ask me later if this is too confusing of an explanation. But basically, greenhouse gas emissions, when you burn landfill gas for energy, are worse than if you just waste the gas by flaring it. And that's even if you account for the idea that if you're displacing a coal plant nearby, it's still actually worse because the amount of methane that leaks out is pretty high, and when you're managing landfills in a way to use it for energy production, more leaks out, because the way they have to manipulate the landfill to do that. So that is a problem which should not be considered renewable. There's also community exposure to methyl mercury and other pollutants that are in there, even tritium from nuclear waste that gets in them. Got into this, got down enough. Let's keep going. So I don't believe that there's such a thing as transition fuels. A transition means that you get from A to C by going through B, right? Almost everything they call a transition fuel doesn't do that. If you think of natural gas as a transition fuel, how many times do you think a natural gas industry that's built pipelines and fracking wells and compressor stations and all the infrastructure they need to have a power plant, how much do you think they're going to, like in 10 years, say, okay, well, the 30-year lifetime of this stuff that we're going to have to pay it off over, well, we're just going to forget all that, tear all this stuff down and put windmills there. That makes no sense. No one's doing that. No one's trying to do that. What these are investment dead ends. They're taking economic resources and putting them into something that is going to be a barrier to moving from B to C, because they're going to lobby against that because they want to keep themselves going. So there is no such thing as a transition fuel unless it actually gets you from one step to the next. And the only example I know that does this is with cars. If you take a normal car and convert it to a hybrid car and then to an electric car, you can actually take the same car and put it through this conversion process. That is something that actually goes from step A to B to C. But I can't think of any other examples where all the things that they're calling transition fuels are actually transitions. Nor is there a need for a transition, because we already have the answers here. We can already do wind and solar. We can already do conservation and efficiency. We can already do some energy storage strategies, although those will get better over time, and there's a lot of improvement that will happen there. So don't accept that whole transition argument when you hear it. Now, the rest of this is just on all kinds of specific different technologies that you might have questions on. So why don't I just stop here and open up to questions and answers, and then if you want to get into like what about nuclear or what about whatever other technology, we can get into some detail on that if you have questions. Yes.
I have one question, but the first one. So will anyone insure a new big nuclear reaction at Fukushima? Like I wouldn't think that would even be something we'd be able to make happen.
The government already has.
The government.
And that's the only reason. There's not a single totally private nuclear reactor in the world that has been built, because the private insurance and private investors won't finance them.
Right. But
So
the
we have,
government
it's
Yes,
called
yes.
the Price-Anderson Act.
Right.
Oh.
And they extended that in that most dreadful anti-environmental bill ever of the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which Senator Obama voted for. That extended it to all new nuclear reactors since then. So the government is going to cover and cap the liability.
Mike, what it does, as you know, is it creates a pool. The utilities with nukes contribute into a pool. I think it's a $260 million ceiling or something. In any event, once that money is gone, it's the taxpayer and the special act of Congress, right into your pocket. In fact, we're watching the Japanese model of socializing nuclear insurance underway right now for decades to come.
Other questions?
I have another
Go
one
ahead.
also. So I have already come to the campaign finance reform point. I've been
Great.
working to advance sustainability for 8 years or so. And I'm now saying, wait a minute, this is what I really need to be doing. So have you already researched what's the best organization to go to get involved in that?
Yes. Good question. Let me see if I can get my browser fired up.
Get rid of the Supreme Court first.
Okay. If you go to corporations.org, which is one of my several websites I run, it's an anti-corporate resources website, and you go, if you can navigate through there, there's a link on the main page that says how to overthrow corporate rule in 5 not so easy steps. That used to be a workshop I did. And one of those steps, step 2, is elections democracy. And so you click there, you get here. Or you can just do corporations.org/solutions/elections. And so this page has some resources on just money and politics, general stuff at the top. But then I have 20 different ways you can get involved to promote democracy. And these are all different election reform tactics. And under each one, I link to groups that are actually working on this. So the best thing that any of you can do, in addition to whatever work you're doing, or in place of whatever work you're doing, whatever level of involvement you prefer, is have at least some bit of a toe into this movement. Pick any one of these groups on here, sign up for their newsletters, help them out, donate to them, whatever you can do to make this part of your work. It's been incredibly frustrating when, over the past several years, I've been trying to get different environmental groups and other groups to realize that this needs to be part of the work, that this is their issue. And everyone's like, oh, we don't have time for that. That's not our issue. That's a different issue. I'm like,
It is the issue.
it's the thing that underpins all of our struggles. Like, if we actually had a democratic society, that we wouldn't have to worry about corporations controlling our politicians and keeping us from getting things done.
Now, to push back a little on that, at the state level in Tennessee, the state legislature, it doesn't take a whole lot of money to get elected to the state legislature, especially from some of the rural districts.
Yeah.
But it does take being extremely right-wing in most of the districts. And that's not because of where the money's coming from, because, I mean, one Tea Partier that got elected spent $1,800 to get elected to the state
Wow.
Senate. And he unseated a very deeply entrenched Democratic senator that just didn't bother to campaign against him. But at the state level, in this state, and at the federal level, you know, our congressional seats, you know, there's no question, but the state legislature, it's kind of a different situation.
Sure, and there's another aspect of democracy that is the reason why all those Fox News watching people think the way they do. And this is it. When Ben Bagdikian first put out his media monopoly book in, what was it, 1983, there were 50 corporations that controlled the majority of all forms of media in this country. Last time he did it in 2004, there were 5. That was 9 years ago. I mean, he was done it for, no, I don't know. I mean, that's pretty serious, right? I mean, well before there was 50, I mean, that number was like hundreds. And so the fact that a handful of corporations, I mean, enough executives you could squeeze them into a phone booth, are controlling the majority of what most people think is a serious problem. But the 1% can really gear people's minds in a way that they're going to elect these corporate-friendly stooges because people don't know what's in their own interest.
Right.
So we need to turn some of that around.
There's a lot of work.
Yes.
You mentioned cutting energy consumption half and half again.
Yeah.
Is that going to require large infrastructure changes to the grid?
I don't know how much it will require to the grid. I mean, yes, because, well, there are two pieces of this answer. One is how centralized our energy sources are. So if we keep having centralized wind and solar versus centralized anything else, then yeah, we'll still need a big grid. The grid is, a lot of energy is lost just in having a centralized grid. So the grid does need to be replaced with something more efficient, but it also needs to be decentralized so we don't need as much of a grid so that we can have a lot of decentralized wind and solar, and then we don't have all those worries of transmission lines and herbicide spraying that goes with them and all that kind of stuff. The other aspect of that is that in order to get more efficient and to conserve as much as we need to, whole buildings need to be rebuilt. A lot of materials have to be spent on refurbishing or redesigning just all the things that we use. So I mean, if we're even if we're talking about throwing out all the inefficient light bulbs in the country and replacing them with new ones, hopefully not the mercury-containing CFLs, but maybe LEDs, there's still materials involved in that. There are exotic metals involved in that. I mean, there's a lot of energy and material use that goes into any kind of material we're talking about. And so even conservation and efficiency, as great as they are, there are going to be a lot of materials that need to be hopefully not wasted and replaced, but recycled at a minimum to make it somewhat more energy efficient. But there will still be a lot of energy and material needed to make that get accomplished.
Do you have any contact with anybody in Washington D.C. as far as on Congress, or any congressman listening to anything that you say?
I live in DC, but I avoid Congress like the plague. I strictly work at the grassroots level, helping local folks stop projects at that level where we have very high success rates. Actually, an exciting thing I can share with you on that. If you look at the track record of grassroots groups since the past several decades, like back to the 70s, you'll see that it's like one community at a time organizing, that stopped the vast majority of make this more visual. So whether you're talking about nuclear reactors, trash incinerators, biomass incinerators, any of these bad, dirty energy and waste facilities, that are the kinds of things that we focus on. About 60 to 95+% of each wave of development that industry has tried to do in these has been crushed one community at a time. Not because NRDC is lobbying in our U.S. Capitol, because they're basically just cutting deals like when they cut a deal with the Carter administration to not fight light water reactors. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that the groups like this do. It's the grassroots stuff that has stopped the bulk of these proposals. And so that's where we focus, that's where it's more efficient. Now, I will say I did go to one lobbying day that we did with the Global Anti-Incinerator Alliance when they organized something several months ago, and there was Senator Carper from Delaware, his aide, who's like in charge of the recycling committee, and even then, where the Democrats control the Senate, we're like talking about how we can get things done, like gee, like a national bottle bill maybe, or something useful on recycling, the issue they care so much about. And they're basically like, yeah, we can't really do anything that matters. It was basically what the aide was telling us. Like we are, like they're basically willing to go as far as getting some studies for us, and I should still find the time to follow up with them and be like, yes, we need Congressional Research Service to like do this study on this and this study on this. So they'll get some studies done. But in terms of actually doing anything that's meaningful, we're basically directly told by this aide for a U.S. senator that, well, we really can't do anything. I mean, that's how paralyzed it is. It's just too corporate control to get anything done at this point.
Well, your graph about the local grassroots groups brings to mind that's why in the Southeast is where most all of the so-called nuclear renaissance was taking place, because people aren't opposing. I mean, we are, but the groups are so small and the support is so thin. That's just a regional issue for us.
Throw up some other visual fundings while we're on that topic. The Southeast is pretty hard hit with new nuclear reactor proposals. That'll come up in a second. Not that one. Here. This is where all the new nuclear reactors are proposed in recent years. Most of these are already withdrawn or defeated, but there are as many as 45 proposals, and the Southeast is pretty heavily targeted, but there are a lot of other areas being sought as well. And part of the demographics of this that get really interesting, there was a study done in California in 1984 when they tried to build 43 trash incinerators. And Sorrell Associates was hired to figure out how do we get these built. Now, only 3 got built, and they were all in communities that were almost entirely Hispanic. But they basically figured out in this study, and I put this online, if you Google Sorrell Associates, this is one of the top hits now, I'm sure they love me for that. But this report that leaked out in 1984 found that southern communities and others are less likely to resist. There are all these criteria demographically that they found of who is more or less likely to resist, and this is why communities of certain types get targeted. You won't see explicitly racial criteria here. They were at least smart enough to not put that in writing, but that's still the ultimate what happened in California with this case, because a lot of criteria like Catholic, low income, overlap with Hispanic population in California on both faces. So that's why things ended up where they did. And this is up on our environmental justice website. This website, ejnet.org/EJ, and if you Google environmental racism, I think it's the first hit after Wikipedia, and you'll see this report is on there. Questions?
How close is storage technology, from what you know, to decentralizing all residential power? Because I imagine that would be one of the first places where it could be done.
Okay. Like if they had solar?
If they had solar, yes.
Yeah. It depends on what kind you're talking about. I mean, basically, we're at a point where it's like not clear which type of energy storage strategy will make sense for most things. And I was just at an industry conference where I was like, well, which one do you think, it was like a panel on energy storage, I'm like, which one do you think is going to shake out to be like the one that makes the most sense? It's going to be batteries, it's going to be flywheels, it's going to be compressed air storage. And his answer, maybe it was self-serving, but it made sense, was he's like all of them. Because they all have different places where they make sense. So some of them geographically would make sense just because you can only do them in certain places, like compressed air storage, for example. Some of them, like hydrogen, you'd be using hydrogen as a battery since it's not an energy source. He was saying things like oil platforms off in the North Sea or something, when they have extra gas that they can't do something with, they can take some of that methane and steam reform it into hydrogen and store that and use that elsewhere. And that can make sense. But in other contexts, hydrogen probably isn't going to make sense. So it might be batteries in most of the residential levels, or flywheels perhaps in other places that have been commercially experimented with. So it might be some combination, and we might see some shaking out of one turns out to be more economical or more hopefully sustainable than others, and those will become more widespread. But it's pretty much in its infancy still, so it's not, we can't really say like this one's going to be the one that dominates it. Question?
I have one more question. So there's no technology that can make waste to energy clean?
Waste to energy is a PR term. It
Yeah.
does not exist in reality, except in newspapers. Waste, you can't turn matter into energy without a nuclear reaction. And thankfully, that's not what's happening in incinerators.
Right.
So we call them waste of energy, though, because it takes energy to recreate the materials that are being destroyed. If you're talking about trash, it's 3 to 5 times more energy to recreate all the paper and plastics and other things that end up getting burned in an incinerator
Right.
than if you recycle those same materials.
But what if the waste that was going to the waste to energy plant,
Or the
all the
incinerator.
recyclables have been extracted from it, which of course would not happen to all of them, or just say 95% of recyclables have been taken away, and what was being incinerated was only stuff that isn't biodegradable and can't be recycled and can't be reused. I know that's a huge
Yeah.
if, but if that was the case, is there a technology that allows it to burn cleanly enough and be turned into
No.
whatever you want to call it? No, nothing. happens.
Incinerators still turn trash into toxic ash and toxic air emissions. And they're so damn expensive that they're the most expensive and polluting way to make energy or to dispose of waste. If you look at every way of making energy, if you're pretending they're about making energy, which they're not, they're about destroying waste. But if you pretend they were about making energy, you look at the latest information from the Energy Information Administration, you'll find that trash incinerators are the most expensive to build and the most expensive to operate and maintain. And even though they get paid for the fuel, they're not paying to get their fuel like coal plants. The only difference between a waste and a fuel in economic sense is who pays who. So waste incinerators, they get paid to take their fuel, and they're still the most expensive to operate and maintain or to build. So it makes no sense.
Don't they use natural gas to
Just to
actually-
fire it up, but not much on a
Not
regular
that much.
basis.
Yeah, it's
No.
very
It's
small.
just a tiny bit again. Yeah, but let me finish answering. So, and then I'll get to your question. So with like the zero waste solutions, which I didn't actually finish passing these around, I think this side got it, but you can pass these around.
Sure.
And I have a much more detailed breakdown of the zero waste stuff that's in another presentation I give, so I can provide that for anyone that wants it. But basically, we have the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle, and then composting. But to get beyond those steps, because there's still something left, what do you do with it, right? If you put an incinerator at the back end, you basically suck up all the money you need to do the front end right. And it creates disincentives to recycling and composting. So what you need to do, instead of pretending that incinerators replace landfills, all they do is make the landfills smaller but more toxic, is you need to look at the stuff at the end, research it, and figure out what's left and how come we fail to account for it more upstream. And that requires redesigning some things, banning some things, and having extended producer responsibility campaigns. Because if you just put it in a box or a landfill or something that makes it look like it's out of sight, out of mind, you're not really you're not figuring out how you failed, what your inefficiencies are. So you need to look at that stuff, and then, as Nova Scotia started to do, and other places around the world have figured out, you want to digest and monofill the stuff. You want to get the methane generating potential out of it by putting it through a digestion process, and then you can burn the energy off of that if you want, so then you're just burning mostly methane. And then you put it in effectively what is a landfill, but just for digested, stabilized waste. And Europe's figuring this out and doing a lot of that same stuff.
You're talking about like waste burning, basically fired facilities, right?
Waste burning what?
Like if you have a gas-fired or coal-fired facilities, you have basically a similar situation with the waste like there are technologies like plasma arc recycling, or instead of burning.
Right, you use the word plasma arc recycling. But go on, but I'll.
Yeah, plasma arc recycling is a different type of technology that instead of combusting, you basically create plasma ionized gases with it. The advantage is that, well, of course you get your syngas that you can use to power the facility, but you can separate the metals and the
Well, the things you
silicates,
can't
which
separate
you can
them.
then use for like a rock wool for insulation, and the metals you can turn into metal recycling factory.
Yeah. I've heard this pitch a few million times. The plasma arc is incineration. There is no such thing as plasma arc recycling. That's a PR crazy term that has no reality to it. Plasma arc is a type of incineration. It's defined and legally regulated as incineration by the US EPA's definition of what a municipal waste combustor is. You can see in here it includes gasification and combustion units. There's another definition that makes it clear that plasma is included in that elsewhere in EPA's regulations. But pyrolysis, plasma arc, and gasification are all types of incineration. They're defined and regulated that way by the US and the European Union. They still destroy materials. They still turn them into toxic ash and toxic air emissions. We can argue whether it's called ash or slag that is the solid waste. But nonetheless, they're still at an incredible cost, making pollutants more available to the environment, making more toxic chemicals that didn't exist in the first place, like dioxins and furans, that get into the air and into the ash. And they're still destroying materials. So the same critiques that I have toward normal conventional incinerators apply to plasma arc. I think we're at time, so thank you. I'll stick around for some questions.